In the last video for Gen Chem 1, we're going to look at molecular polarity. And polarity is the idea that your electrons aren't shared equally between your atoms. And if your electrons aren't shared equally, you can have what's called a dipole moment, which is shown here between chlorine and hydrogen. So chlorine is a much more electronegative atom than hydrogen, so you get a polar bond. The chlorine will take electrons from the hydrogen. And we can show that by writing a dipole, which is this cross in an arrow, where the cross or plus sign shows you where your positive density is, or your lack of electrons are, and the arrow is your negative electron density, or your more electrons are. And shown here, this is also an image of HCl. So we can write that your hydrogen is partial positive. That's what this sign means. And your chlorine is partial negative. If we look at density, there are a lot more electrons near chlorine than there are hydrogen. And the colors mean blue is positive, yellow/red is negative, and green is neutral. So what's happening is that chlorine is stealing the majority of the electrons from hydrogen, or the electrons are usually around chlorine. So chlorine is a little bit negative and hydrogen is a little bit positive, but you're not in an ionic bond. It's not a complete transfer of electrons, so there is no formal charges on these molecules. We can compare that with something like CO2, where carbon is bound to two oxygens. You have the same amount of pulling from each oxygen. So you have a dipole going to the left, and you have a dipole going to the right. And what happens is that these dipoles cancel each other out, so you have no net dipole moment, and you have no net positive or negative electron density, as shown here. Most of this is green. It's a little blue around carbon because carbon is getting electrons pulled in both directions, but overall this has no dipole moment. Unlike water, water has a very big dipole moment because you have oxygen, which is a very electronegative atom, and two hydrogens. So the oxygen takes the electrons from hydrogen in an unequal manner, and it has two dipoles. And if you add these two dipoles together, you get a dipole moment that looks like this, where your positives between the hydrogens and your negatives on the oxygen. And we can write that with these lowercase delta symbols again. Oxygen is partially negative, hydrogens are partially positive. And the way you predict polarity is, first you have to draw the Lewis structure and determine the molecular geometry. Then you determine if there are polar bonds. If you have no polar bonds, then this molecule is nonpolar. If you find a polar bond, then draw that arrow to get the dipole. And if you get a net dipole moment, that is, your dipoles don't cancel out, you have a polar molecule. And that's it for this video, and that's it for all the videos in Gen Chem 1. Thank you for staying with me and watching all the videos, and you should be very proud of yourself if you made it this far. And good luck on the final that's going to be here before you know it. And I will not see you in the next video because there are no more.